Hello, everyone. This is recording number 9 for my Intro to Philosophy and AI. I want to pursue a distinction that I introduced in the last recording between whether we can ascribe mental states or intelligence to something, on the one hand, and on the other hand, what is actually going on in the brain or in a machine. And to that end, I want to turn to a foundational paper in the field by Alan Turing, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published in 1950. So Turing starts out with the question, can machines think? And then he says right away that posed in these terms, machines and thinking, the question is too imprecise. And he says he wants to replace it by something that is closely related, but less ambiguous. He does not, in fact, however, replace the question with another question. He replaces it with what he calls the imitation game. And then later researchers have replaced, in turn, the imitation game by what they call the Turing test, partly because the imitation game is ultimately rather complicated. But the thought is that the Turing test captures the core intuitions of the imitation game. So here's how it works. There is a so-called judge or interrogator in one room, and there are two other rooms. And in one of these other rooms, there is a machine, and in the third room, there is a person. So the judge poses questions and receives replies from these two other rooms and aims to assess which replies come from the machine and which come from the person. Now, the machine passes the Turing test if the judge cannot discern which set of replies comes from the machine. Now, suppose that the machine passes the Turing test. It is not obvious what follows. Recall that we set aside the question of whether machines can think as too imprecise. So we can't say, well, if the machine passes the Turing test, it can think. That is out. So what are we going to say instead? Perhaps you might think, well, if the machine passes the Turing test, what it does is it succeeds at imitating human thought. But that is not Turing's upshot. Instead, here is how Turing proceeds. So he says, well, couldn't it be the case that a machine carries out something that we ought to describe as thinking? And yet it is very different from what a human being does. And then he acknowledges that with this question comes potentially a pretty strong objection. An objection that is, as it were, about the difference between how we describe something and what is actually going on. But then he says that, well, if the machine can play the imitation game successfully, then we need not be worried by this objection. We just needn't trouble ourselves with that. And I want to end with the question of whether that is right. Should we be worried by that objection or not? And I will pursue that line of thought in the next couple of recordings with a view to how it bears on AI today.